moving on to another big name, not John Bolton's book, a different book. Former United Nations Ambassador Nikki Haley, she's making some eyebrow-raising claims in exactly that, a new book that she is selling. In it, she says that former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson and former White House Chief of Staff John Kelly tried to get her to undermine President Trump to, quote, save the country.
Instead of saying that to me, they should have been saying that to the president, not asking me to join them on their sidebar plan. It should have been, go tell the president what your differences are and quit if you don't like what he's doing. But to undermine a president is really a very dangerous thing.
Joining us now, former White House Chief of Staff to President George W. Bush, Andy Card. Andy, your first reaction to this, if Nikki Haley, if what she's saying is true, two very senior people, Tillerson and John Kelly, willing to go to lengths like this to undermine the president. You've worked in a White House. What do you think about that?
Well, first of all, I want to honor our veterans today. I just came from a wonderful service at Cathedral of the Pines in Rindge, New Hampshire, and it was very, very moving. So today is a day to remember those people who served our country in the military. With regard to Nikki Haley, I have great respect for Nikki Haley, as I do for Rex Tillerson and John Kelly. I think that Nikki was probably wrong to put this in a book. To me, this is... Even if there were conversations like this, and I suspect maybe she's telling the truth, I have no reason to doubt her, it's not the kind of thing that you want to talk about. But yes, people should have the courage to speak truth to power and accept the consequences of doing that. And if you work at the White House, that's one thing that I think every president should respect and expect. I would think that they would respect that people should tell the truth to power, and I think that presidents should say, I expect you to tell the truth to power. I'm not sure Donald Trump does that, but that's been my experience.
So if he doesn't do that, because we've sort of heard that he doesn't do that, he doesn't really likes people to say what he wants them to say. And if Tillerson and Kelly both had real concerns and the president's not going to listen to them, were they doing the wrong thing by going to talk to Nikki Haley about it?
Well, I'm hoping that both Rex Tillerson and John Kelly did have the courage to speak truth to power. I have no reason to believe they didn't or don't.
When you say that, you mean to speak directly to the president about their concerns?
They should speak direct. I'm concerned with what you're doing, Mr. President. I don't think it's the right thing for the country. I don't think it's the right thing for diplomacy, whatever it is.
Right.
Speaking truth to power is critically important if you're going to serve in these positions. If they did that and there was no reaction from the president, I do think it's justifiable to say, I'm a little concerned. Are you concerned, Nikki, or
right.
do you and speak up? But I don't like this dirty linen being aired all over the place. I want people around the world to have confidence in our government and its ability to do the job that needs to be done for the world, not just for the United States, but for the world. So I am troubled by this whole thing. And look, I respect our Constitution. I took an oath to serve the Constitution, and I'd like everybody who serves in government to recognize their responsibilities, including that for serving for Article 2 of the Constitution, the President of the United States. He deserves to have candid counsel that is not going to be shared with the broad world in order to be able to do his job well.
Then, given this moment in history, tell us what you're most uncomfortable with, because it seems that there are three different paths now taken by former Trump officials who have left the administration. One, say nothing, but stay in this White House, continue to support the president or do the best you can. Two, quit and publicly speak out against the president. Or now this third lane, which Nikki Haley resides in, where say nothing publicly initially, even though it's a public service, but then get a book deal where you're profiting off telling the truth of what happened. What's the most disturbing for you?
Well, I do expect people who would serve the president to recognize that they don't just do what the president wants to do. They advise the president on what he should be doing. And they should have the courage to say, Mr. President, I don't think you should be doing that, or I do think you're doing, whatever it is. Speak candidly. That should be a protected conversation. They should not be forced to acknowledge what they advised the president to do or what the president told them about the advice that they gave. I respect that. Keep it inside the executive branch. The president deserves to have, I'm going to say, counsel from people that will be unvarnished. And I hope the president invites that. It doesn't sound like he does, but they should do that. If you cannot serve the president, ethics are more important than any job you have in government. So if your conscience bothers you, you should not serve the president if you feel he's not doing the job that you think should be done. Even, I'm not talking about just disagreeing with him. The president's the president. You're not the president. So it isn't that your policies have to be put in place. But if you don't think that he's honoring his oath of office, that's a very different thing. You should leave the White House, but I would leave so without creating waves. Don't make it more difficult for the president to do his job. But if you are asked to testify before Congress or invited to help become part of an investigation that would uncover things that you knew about, I think you do have an obligation to recognize the responsibilities that come with taking the oath to the Constitution, not just your service to the president.
Well said, Andy Card. Good to see you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, MSNBC fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down there and click on any of the videos here to watch the latest interviews and highlights. You can get more MSNBC for free every day with our newsletters. Just visit msnbc.com/newsletters to sign up now.